Nova Anglia, the Latinized version of New England, was a colony founded by pilgrims in 1620 who sailed away on the Mayflower from England in search of a new home in the New World. But what if I told you that this wasn't the first New England, and that the official Nova Anglia was founded in Crimea, of all places, by Anglo-Saxon exiles in the closing days of the 11th century? So how did the Anglo-Saxons get to the Crimean Peninsula, and why were they there in the first place? Most importantly, is this real? Was there truly a medieval New England in modern-day Ukraine? To accompany us on this historical journey, we are left with two sources: an Icelandic saga recounting the life of Edward the Confessor, the King of England, and a medieval chronicle that was written by an English monk living in France. The two sources differ very little and tell the same Odyssey-like tale. In 1066, William the Conqueror invaded England and slew Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king. This led to William declaring himself as the new king, and much of England submitted to their new conqueror. However, in the north, a strong Anglo-Saxon and Danish resistance continued against King William. Their goal was to appoint the son of the late King Edward the Confessor as the rightful ruler of England. This teenager was named Edgar Atheling, and in 1069 he arrived in Northumbria along with an army supplied by the King of Denmark to oust William from England. Combining his Danish force with the Anglo-Saxon rebels, led by one Hereward the Wake, Edgar was confident that he could defeat William. Together, this mixed bag of an army retook York and much of Northumbria. King William responded by retaking the city and paying off the Danish army. From here, the conqueror devastated the countryside in his so-called harrying of the north. Eventually, he arrived at the rebel stronghold of Hereward the Wake on the Isle of Ely in 1071. After a bloody battle in the marshes, William sent both Hereward and Edgar to flight, stamping out the rebels and imprisoning many of their leaders. This is where our known history ends and our two sources come into play. Keep in mind that the dates in both of them are foggy at best. Sometime after the harrying of the north, a grand host of 350 ships worth of Anglo-Saxons, disgruntled with their Norman conquerors, and made way for the Mediterranean. Among their crew was 3 earls and 8 barons, who were led by an old Earl of Gloucester. Our two sources offer different names for this so-called earl. The Icelandic saga calls him Sigurd, while the medieval chronicle names him as Stanardus. Regardless of his name, the old earl and his grand host entered the Mediterranean Sea and quickly made their presence known. The 350-ship fleet plundered the city of Ceuta in North Africa, killing their Muslim governor and taking vast wealth, as they continued their journey to find a new homeland. The fleet went north and sacked the Balearic Islands of Majorca and Minorca, again leaving nearly as soon as they came. These exile Anglo-Saxon Vikings made their way to Sardinia, where they again probably raided their way down the island. From Sardinia, the fleet went south to Sicily, which was in the midst of a war between Muslims and the people whom the Anglo-Saxons were trying so hard to escape, the Normans. It's unknown what the old Earl of Gloucester did in Sicily, if they sided with the Muslims or got revenge on the Normans, or neither. But they soon left after hearing of trouble brewing in the Eastern Roman Empire. As the saga and chronicle state, the Anglo-Saxon fleet made way to Constantinople, which was currently under siege by infidels. The Earl's fleet defeated these infidels, much to the praise of Emperor Alexios Komnenos. However, there are no sieges of Constantinople recorded any time after 1066, so it's more likely that Anglo-Saxon exiles defeated a Pecheneg invasion in the Balkans or perhaps the army of the Norman Lord of Sicily, Robert Guiscard. Regardless of who they might have defeated, the Earl and his grand fleet arrived before Emperor Alexios, who was so impressed that he offered them a place in his Varangian Guard, the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors who mostly descended from Scandinavian peoples. Some of the Anglo-Saxons took this deal and joined the Varangians, while others, such as the old Earl of Gloucester, were not satisfied with Alexios' deal. The Earl wanted a new land to call home, not a job as a mercenary. For him and those who did not join the Varangians, Alexios offered a land across the Black Sea. The problem was that he did not own this land, as it had fallen into the hands of his enemies. Whether it be rebellion or an external conqueror, we do not know. After 6 days and nights of traversing the Black Sea, the Earl and his fleet arrived somewhere in or around the Crimean Peninsula. There was also a possibility that they arrived farther in the east, around modern-day Bulgaria, but more evidence points towards the Crimea, so that is where we will direct our story. After fighting many battles, the Earl and his entourage managed to defeat the locals and drive away their population. Here, the Anglo-Saxon fleet finally found a new home and called the land Nova Anglia. Henceforth, the new settlers began naming cities after place names in England, such as London, York, and Sussex. When a Byzantine official arrived to collect taxes from Nova Anglia, the inhabitants killed him, sending a clear message to Alexios that New England was an independent state. After this, the Anglo-Saxon fleet reawakened and started Viking-like raids on Byzantine shipping and coastal settlements all over the Black Sea. This caused the Anglo-Saxons who had joined the Varangian Guard to flee their post and join their brothers in Nova Anglia. This new wave of settlers set up cities such as Varangilimon and Varangido, which are quite obviously derived from the word Varangian. As told by our two sources, that is how the Anglo-Saxons created a New England in medieval Crimea. But is this true, and how do we prove it? One place to start this investigation is to find out who the leader of this Odyssey, the old Earl of Gloucester, actually was. As stated previously, our two sources differ on his name, Siward and Stanardus. So, let's take a look at a few theories for who this mystery Earl might be. Our first theory paints the Earl of Gloucester as a random English nobleman who made his way to Constantinople during the First Crusade. This is our least likely theory, as the First Crusade began in 1095, which is a stretch from the 1066 Norman conquest. This theory also leaves us with no matching name for any Earl of Gloucester. It's more likely that the Anglo-Saxon fleet gave Alexios the idea to call for aid from the west to dispose of his Seljuk Turk rivals. And if the 350 ship fleet did arrive during the First Crusade, then why wouldn't Alexios direct them to the other Western Europeans retaking the Levant? For this, I find it highly unlikely that Nova Anglia was a Crusader state in Crimea. Another theory regarding the identity of the old Earl of Gloucester finds us looking at the life of the King of England who never was, Edgar Atheling. After being defeated by King William in 1071, Edgar Atheling had been all over Western Europe, residing in the courts of William's enemies. At one point from 1072 to 1074, the Atheling found himself in Flanders, home to Count Robert the Frisian. Then, in 1074, King Philip of France gave Edgar land that was directly on the borders of Flanders and King William's Normandy. This was done so Edgar could raid his usurping rival's ducal possessions in France. Here, Edgar Atheling stayed until 1086, when he likely accompanied his ally, Count Robert of Flanders, to an expedition into the Mediterranean. Edgar ventured towards Sicily, where he helped the Hauteville family of Normans in conquering the island. For this, the King of Sicily, William the Bad, who really wasn't all that bad, granted 2 estates to the exile king. From here, Edgar and Count Robert made their way to Jerusalem, peacefully making the pilgrimage to the Holy City under the watch of their armed retinue. At this time, Jerusalem and much of the Middle East was under the domain of the Seljuk Turks. Upon leaving Jerusalem, the pair received word that Emperor Alexios was looking for able-bodied warriors to help him in his struggles with the Seljuks, who had only just won their premier battle of Manzikert 9 years previous. Together with the Emperor, the two armies managed to push back the infidels and win a decisive battle. This is, again, where the completely attested to history ends and our two sources about Nova Anglia begin. Edgar had just assisted the Emperor by defeating some of his enemies, and now he was given the go-ahead to retake Crimea in the name of Constantinople. The story therefore has to remain the same if Edgar was the Earl in question. The usurped King of England created a Nova Anglia to rule over that was far away from the grasp of William and the Normans. However, if Edgar did create Nova Anglia, then he left very swiftly, arriving back in his French estates by 1087, leaving him almost no time to make it from France to Crimea by sea and back again in the span of 2 years. If he did somehow speedily make it back to France, then it would make sense why he might join the First Crusade of 1095. Some think that after the Crusade was over, Edgar Atheling joined the Varangian Guard, although there is no evidence to support this. Eventually, Edgar would die an old man in an England that was never his own. There are some glaring problems with the theory that Edgar Atheling is the Earl of Gloucester, attested to have created Nova Anglia. However, there are also a few arguments to be made here in his favor. For one, his relations to Robert the Frisian and their joint 1086 expedition into the Mediterranean does line up well with our sources, with Edgar arriving in Sicily and then going to Constantinople. Edgar and Robert assisting Emperor Alexios against the Seljuks does also line up with our sources in the sense that it calls the Byzantines' enemies infidels, a term synonymous at that time with Muslims, of which the Seljuks were. Edgar, perhaps more than anyone at this time other than William the Conqueror, could assemble a large Anglo-Saxon army if he wished to. And while there is no evidence that Edgar joined the Varangian Guard, it is supported by the fact that many Anglo-Saxons were Varangians after the events of 1066. The most glaring issue with the Edgar Atheling theory is the fact that his name is nowhere close to the name of our old Earl, Siward or Stanardus. The Atheling was also a young man, while our sources omit that our mystery Earl was elderly. There are also no sources for Edgar in regards to him being around Crimea or even the northern coast of the Black Sea. Even still, we don't have any evidence that Edgar raided Ceuta or any of the Balearic Islands. If Edgar did found Nova Anglia, then he must have also been one of the fastest medieval travelers. He was one of the best traveled men in Europe at this point, and was quite used to running from William the Conqueror. However, this leaves us room for Edgar to appoint an old Earl of Gloucester to become the leader of Nova Anglia in his absence, which is also another possibility. Our sources do also state that the Anglo-Saxon fleet left directly from England and not from France or Flanders. For these many reasons, I find it highly unlikely, but not impossible, that Edgar the Atheling created Nova Anglia. For our final and most likely theory about the mystery Earl of Gloucester, it takes us back to an England before the year 1066. Here lived a thane named Siward Barn, a noble and warrior of prestigious rank who owned at least 30 properties in England, included among them being an estate in Gloucester. At this point of the conquest in 1066, Siward Barn was the 21st most wealthiest landowner in all of England. After the Battle of Hastings, Siward joined the Anglo-Saxon resistance in the north, teaming up with various leaders such as Edgar Atheling and Hereward the Wake. During the 1071 Battle of Ely, Siward led a valiant last stand against King William, where he was defeated and imprisoned. While he did lose the battle, he did manage to hold off the Normans long enough for Hereward and the Atheling to make their escape. Siward was imprisoned, and all of his land was confiscated and parceled out to the new Norman ruling elite. Here, Siward Barn would remain jailed for the next 16 years. By 1087, King William was on his gruesome deathbed, and in his last moments he released some of his greatest rivals from his dungeon, including Siward Barn. After this, Siward completely disappears from the pages of history, unless, of course, he is the founder of Nova Anglia. If he is, his story would be just like the saga and chronicle told, as we have no available sources to say otherwise. While Siward Barn is the founder of Nova Anglia does make more sense than Edgar Atheling, there are a few problems, but they don't exactly destroy this theory. For one, Siward was never an earl, but this can be explained as he was a high-ranking noble who owned a large estate in Gloucester. There are also the so-called infidels that the Anglo-Saxons defeated to gain the favor of the emperor, This could still be the Seljuks or perhaps the nomadic Pechenegs, but we just don't know in this case. The only other problem with the Siward theory is the fact that he disappeared from the historical record. This, however, would give him more than enough time to travel to Crimea and carve out a new Anglo-Saxon homeland. There is far more evidence that supports Siward being the old Earl of Gloucester, most important among them being that his name lines up with the name given from the Icelandic saga. Siward Barn was also a far older man than Edgar Atheling and owned property in Gloucester. Siward Barn had lost all of his many estates during his 16-year imprisonment. These two things combined probably led him to seek his glory and wealth somewhere else after his release. He was also a war hero among the Anglo-Saxon resistance and probably could have mustered a large force to follow him wherever he chose to go. But 350 ships? Probably not. Another important point is Siward's last name, or his nickname, of Barn. Barn comes from the Anglo-Saxon word bairn, which means child. This suggests that Siward was a child of, or perhaps a direct descendant of, one of the Anglo-Saxon kings of England, giving him a birthright to conquer a place and call it New England. If Nova Anglia was real, then it was Siward Barn who founded it. So now that we've identified our mystery Earl, who turned out to not even be an Earl, what other evidence do we have for Nova Anglia? For starters, there was a large number of Anglo-Saxons in the Varangian Guard during the life of Alexios Komnenos, meaning that these people were definitely in the region. Evidence also survives in a map of the Black Sea dated to 1553. On the Crimean Peninsula, there are two names that catch the eye. Londina, which is obviously London, and Susseco, which sounds a whole lot like Sussex. Even more evidence can be found in a 1246 account from a Franciscan friar, who writes about a people known as the Saxi, living on and around the Crimean Peninsula. Saxi can easily be identified as Saxon. The Franciscan, who was on a mission of conversion, states that the Saxi were already Christian, opposed to the surrounding peoples. The Franciscan also tells of a Saxi city being sieged by the Tartars, where the Saxi ferociously defended their settlement with axes, a favorite tool of Anglo-Saxon warriors. Even yet, there is more evidence in the form of linguistics. Combined with the extinct Crimean Gothic language, there is evidence of a West Germanic influence, and English just so happened to be the farthest west of the Germanic language family tree. Unless more irrefutable evidence surfaces, we'll likely never know for certain if medieval Nova Anglia was a real place. Although after doing this investigation, I'm leaning to believe the main points of this story, although I do think much of it was embellished. But if it was true, then medieval Nova Anglia preceded American New England by more than 500 years. The two New Englands, separated by so much time, do share one similarity. Both groups were exiles from their English homeland. While one went east, the latter turned to the new west. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month and join Derek Clark and Savak Leo Nazarian, or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again and Donald Vincent. Thank you guys again for supporting the channel.